In this video, we are taking the next step into creating our bow, and that is keeping track of when the attack input is being held down so that we can keep the bow drawn and control when we release our arrow. So welcome to Bardent, my name is Heinrich, and this is part 17 of the multi-weapon system series. We are introducing a new weapon component today, the InputHold component. So just like all the other components that we've created so far, we need to start by creating all the relevant data and component classes. However, unlike those components, the InputHold component does not have any attack-specific data. It is a component that is simply responsible for updating the weapon animator's hold parameter. So that means we only need 2 of the classes instead of 3. One for the component itself that sits on the weapon, and one for the component data that is needed for us to be able to add it to the asset over here. So this class. Let's go ahead and come to our IDE and open up our File Explorer. And then in the Weapons folder, Components, Component Data, the first class I want to create is the component itself. So in the Components folder, right-click on that, hit Add, New C# class, and we're just going to call this one InputHold. Now this component is going to inherit from Weapon component. But this time, instead of using this generic version, we're just going to use the base weapon component class. And that is because if we use the generic version, we would have to pass in attack data, which this component doesn't have. So this is the only thing we need to add to this one for it to work. Next, let's go ahead and come to our component data folder. Right-click on that, hit Add, New C# class, and this one is going to be the InputHold data. Now for this class, we're simply going to inherit from component data. And again, we don't want the generic version because that requires attack data, which we don't have. So just component data. Now it's going to give us an error because it wants us to implement the setComponentDependency function. So we can just go ahead and hit Control-Full-Stop, say implement missing members, or you can just type it out yourself. So that'll be protected override void setComponentDependency. And then in here, all we say is component dependency equals type of, and the type we pass in here is the InputHold class we just created. And that's basically all that we have to do for our component data. With this created, our component will show up in our list of buttons, so we can add it to our weapon. So next we can shift our attention back to the actual InputHold component. So let's come back to the class, and let's again quickly talk about what this component does. So on our bow, if we just go ahead and open up that real quick, if we come to the hierarchy, player, primary weapon, I have the bow animator assigned to the animator. If we take a look at that, take a look at our parameters, we have this hold boolean that controls when we can leave this bow idle animation. So this component is simply responsible for setting this parameter to true or false based on our actual mouse input, or whatever our input is. So that means, back in our component, the first thing we need is a reference to our animator. So let's declare a private animator, call it anim. Don't forget to include using the UnityEngine.animator, or just using Unity Engine. And then next, I'm just going to create a private bool that's going to store the current input. So just call it input. Next, let's go ahead and quickly set the reference to our animator. So let's override our awake function. And after base.awake, we'll say anim equals get component in children and pass in animator as the type. So now our component should have a reference to the animator. Let's create a function that sets that whole parameter to whatever the value is for input. So let's create a private void, call it setAnimatorParameter. And in this function, all we're going to say is anim.setBool, and we're going to pass in hold as the name, and then input as the value. So where is this input value going to come from? Well, I think it makes sense for us to put it on our weapon. So let's go ahead and open up our weapon script. And just below current attack counter, let's go ahead and create another property. So public bool in this case, call it CurrentInput. Now we're going to give this property a getter and a setter, but before we can do that, let's quickly come to our private variables and declare another private bool, CurrentInput, with a lowercase c. And then back up in our property, we can say get returns CurrentInput, but set is going to do something for us. Now what I want to do here is I'm going to check what the current input is and then what we're trying to set it to. And if we're trying to set it to something different, I want to fire off an event broadcasting the fact that the current input has changed. So I don't want to fire off this event every time this current input gets assigned, just every time it actually changes. So before we can do that, we also need to go ahead and create this event. So just at the very top over here, I'm going to declare a public event that has the type action. This event is going to have a bool input parameter, and I'm just going to call it onCurrentInputChange. Then back in this property that we've been working on, I'm just going to say if currentInput does not equal value, then currentInput equals value and onCurrentInputChange.invoke, passing in the new current input. So this still doesn't solve where does this input actually come from, but we're going to eventually set this from our PlayerAttackState. For now, this is just a way for us to get that information from our player to our specific weapon component. So with this created, that means we can come back to our InputHold class. And in here, let's go ahead and create a handler function for when our input does change. So I'm going to declare a private void handle currentInputChange. This function takes in a bool called newInput. And in here, all I'm going to say is input equals newInput. And then I'm going to call this setAnimator parameter function. So with the handler created, that means we need to go ahead and actually subscribe this handler to that event. So in the awake function, after we get a reference to our animator, let's go ahead and say weapon.onCurrentInputChange plus equals handle currentInputChange. And then we also need to override our onDestroy function. So protected override void onDestroy, and after base.onDestroy, we'll say weapon.onCurrentInputChange minus equals handle currentInputChange. Okay, so now all we need to do is actually set our current input on our weapon. So let's go ahead and come to our PlayerAttackState. So that's going to be up in the player folder, player states, substates, PlayerAttackState. So what we need to do is we need to get the input that is actually triggering the attack and pass it on to our weapon in our logic update function. So actually, before we do anything here, let's take a look at our PlayerInput class or PlayerInput handler. So in here we have this public bool array called attackInputs, and the values in this array get set by two functions, on primary attack input and on secondary attack input. So each element of this array gets set accordingly based on this combat inputs enum. So our PlayerAttackState has access to this input handler class, so we can get this information. We now just need to assign a combat input to our states. So let's go ahead and come back to our PlayerAttackState. And in here, in our constructor, let's add which attack this is. Is this the primary attack or is this the secondary attack? So after weapon, go ahead and add combat input and just call it input. Then let's go ahead and create a variable at the top that is private int input index. Then back in the constructor, we can say input index equals int input. So we're taking this enum, casting it to an int, and storing it in here. So with that, it means we can come and override our logic update function. And then in here, all we need to say is weapon dot current input equals player dot input handler dot attack inputs, and we want to read the input at the input index. Now the last thing we need to do is simply assign our combat input to our attack states. And we do that back in our player class. So you can see over here now we have this error in player.cs, and that's because our player attack states now expect an input. So for primary weapon, after we pass in the primary weapon game object, we can say combat inputs dot primary. And the same thing for the secondary weapon. So combat inputs dot secondary. It's getting a little long, so I apologize if that's difficult to see, but that's essentially what it looks like. So that means now that our attack states will read the correct inputs and pass it on to our weapon every single logic update. And so with that done, it means we should be able to test it. So let's come back to Unity. Let's come to our bow data. And under add components, let's go ahead and add the InputHold data. And then now if we run the game, if we hold our primary input, you can see that our bow stays drawn, and then if we release it, it fires. So just as simple as that. Now this part isn't quite over. There's a couple more things that we need to cover. And the first thing is, if you go ahead and just hit Control S, like you're saving your project, and if you're using some sort of source control, check to see if your bow_1 asset has been updated. So if I just go ahead and bring over my GitHub desktop over here, oops, you can see that bow_1 is nowhere in this list of changed files. So that means if we were to close the Unity project now and open it back up and come to bow_1, this InputHold data would no longer be part of component data, at least not until we change something else about this. So if we were to say add another component like damage data, even now if we hit Control S, it doesn't show up. But within damage data, if we were to just set this amount to something, and now we hit Control S, and if we look at our source control, now suddenly we have bow_1_asset. So that's a bit of a problem. We want to be able to save our asset even when we just add a component, not only when we make changes to the data within that component. So how do we do that? What we need to do is tell the Unity editor that this asset is dirty, that it can be saved. So what we need to do is come back to our editor, and then we need to come to our weapon data SO editor, which is in the weapons folder, editor folder. So just go ahead and expand that and open up weapon data SO editor. And now over here, we have this for each loop that is looping through all the different data component types and creating the button that we see in the inspector. And then if we click that button, it does this. It adds a new instance of that data to our list over here. So you can see we pass the new component we created to data SO, where data SO is basically our .asset file. So all we need to do is after we added it, we can say editor utility .set dirty. And then to this function, we need to pass the object that is dirty, which is data SO. So if we pass that in and then come back to Unity, now let's just quickly go ahead and reset our bow data. So if I just right click on this and say discard changes. Now in bow 1, we don't have the InputHold anymore. If we go ahead and add it, you'll see it still doesn't show up. But now, even though we haven't changed anything else about the data, if we hit Control S, you can see our mouse got the little loading icon. And if we check it out, there we go. There's our bow1 asset showing that we added the InputHold data. Perfect. And so we essentially could call it a day there, but I'm not done quite yet. Now, one thing that I have in my prototype for this project is the ability to release a fired arrow early, or to release the bow early. So you can draw the bow to full strength and release to get a full strength shot, but you can also just tap fire it essentially. So one thing we need to add is in our animator for the bow, we need to add an early exit transition from our bow anticipation to the bow action animation. So I'm just going to drag bow idle a little down like that, and then add a new transition from bow anticipation to bow action. And then the transition condition over here is no exit time. Transition duration is 0. And then condition is that hold must be false. So that means now when we run the game, if we kind of just tap it, you can see that it quickly switches to our fire animation. But now the only problem is maybe it's releasing a little bit too quickly. So the last thing I want to add is the ability to define what the minimum hold time is. So weapons that have hold input, there is a minimum amount of time that needs to pass before that hold boolean can get set back to false. And we're going to do this with an animation event. So let's go ahead and come back to our code, and let's open up our animation event handler script. In here, I'm going to create a new event called onMinHoldPast. We can then also go ahead and create the trigger. So private void minHoldPast trigger, and then simply invoke the onMinHoldPast event. Finally, we can go ahead and come back to our InputHold class. And now in here, you'll see why we created a separate function for this. The first thing we need to do, however, is subscribe to this new event that we just created. So let's create a new handler, private void handle minHoldPast, and then come down to our awake function. And in here, I'll say event handler dot on minHoldPast plus equals handle minHoldPast. Go ahead and copy this, paste it into on destroy, and change the plus equals to minus equals. Now in this handle minHoldPast function, what I want to do is actually first keep track of whether minHold has passed or not. So let's create a new boolean for that. So private bool minHoldPast. And then what needs to happen is we start by setting this boolean to false when the attack starts. So in the enter function, so let's override the handle enter function. And in here we say minHoldPast equals false. And then back in handle minHoldPast, we'll say minHoldPast equals true. And then we'll again call this set animator parameter function. Now in the set animator parameter, what we want to do is we want to set the hold parameter to true when input is true, but if input is false, we only want to set it to false when minHoldPast is true. So I'm going to say if input. So if input is true, then we can say anim.setBool hold to input, and then we can return. Otherwise, we can say if minHoldPast, then set anim.setBool hold to input as well. Now that might seem a little bit strange, but what's essentially going to happen is whenever one of these handle functions get called, we're going to come down here, we're going to check what the input value is. If it's true, we're simply going to set the parameter to true and nothing else is going to happen. We'll always return. If input is false, it means we'll skip over here and then we'll check to see if minHold has passed. If it has, then we'll set the input to false. In this case, it will be false. We could just replace this with false like that. It doesn't really matter. But that's basically it. So now all we need to do is set up our animation events and then we can try it out. So if we come back to Unity and go ahead and come to our hierarchy and select the base primary weapon, come to the animation window, and over here I'm just going to add a new animation event and the function is minHoldPast trigger. Now if we just set this animation event to the very end, you'll see that even though we have that transition going from the anticipation to exit, even if we just tap our input, the entire anticipation animation will play. But if we go ahead and set this to like in the middle over here, you'll see that we no longer have to play the entire animation, but it's not as fast as it was before. We do have to play a certain amount of the animation first. Now I know with my animations where the anticipation is only made out of 2 frames, it's kind of difficult to see what's happening, but I'm sure a lot of you can see the point of this and how this could be useful. It might not be as useful on our bow, but this is also going to come into play for our shield. For something like when you dedicate to parry or blocking, you dedicate yourself to that attack. You can't just suddenly change what you're doing. So it'll essentially be used for when can I cancel my attack. You can't just start an attack and cancel it immediately. You have to follow through at least a little bit before we give you back any sort of control over that. And that's essentially it for this episode. So we now have the ability to hold our input and pass that through to our weapon so that we can control how the weapon animation flows using our input. I think that's pretty cool. So as I'm recording this, I don't know what the next episode is going to be about. I know in the last episode I said we're going to start with projectiles in this video, but I was wrong. I usually just go back through my prototype and try and figure out what is the next logical step, and I don't know what that is at the moment. It might be projectiles, it might be not. It's a fun little surprise for next week. But with that being said, that's it for this video. If you would like early access to the prototype that I'm using for this project, it's available over on Patreon to all of my patrons. And with that being said, I would just like to say thank you to all of my supporters and wonderful people over on Patreon. And a huge special thank you to Cody Lee, SM, Major Sins, Jake Skarupa, Patrick, Atami, Mike Rodriguez, Nathan Ackley, and CC Fuster. You guys are absolute mad lads, and I hope you all have a wonderful day.